one of my talks. And last time I did a bit of a general overview of fossils that I found in Fife, but people seem to be quite interested in the shark teeth. And one of the things about sharks from the Carboniferous is that they are quite complex. So they asked if I could do another talk, so that's why I'm here today. And just before I start again, I'm just going to go over the Scottish Fossil Code. If you are thinking about going collecting, just make sure you have a look at the Nature Scot website and read their fossil code rules and everything, and check that you're not hunting in a SSSI as well. So I've got this SSSI map here. So all the red parts that you can see on here are actually SSSI. So the whole of the Fife coast here is a SSSI, which means you can't collect or remove material from bedrock. So it's just something to be aware of if you are going to go out fossil hunting. And a quick overview of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to go into a bit of detail about what are sharks and the 450 million years that sharks have been around, and then look at some of the fossil evidence that we have and some of the early Carboniferous sharks, both freshwater that you get in Scotland, but also the marine sharks as well. And then look at the types of different morphologies of teeth and what that tells us about the sharks and their diets and things. So to start, what are sharks? So sharks, skates and rays collectively form a subclass of the Elasmobranchii, which belongs to the class Chondrichthyes, and they're the cartilaginous fish. So basically their skeletons are composed completely of cartilage rather than bone. And they are sort of the sister group to the Osteoichthyes, which are the bony fish. And the class of Chondrichthyes comprises 1,050 extant species. So that means living species of shark. And that contains 12 orders, which are divided between two subclasses, the Elasmobranchii, which is the sharks, rays and skates, and then your Holocephali, which are chimaeras. And today, the Holocephali are represented by only about 40 living species of chimera. And back in the Carboniferous, they were way, way more diverse. And the vast majority of living sharks are Elasmobranch. And on the right-hand side here, you can see a clade diagram, which is just showing where the Chondrichthyes have branched off, where you have the holocephalan stem and then the Elasmobranch stem. And this is more to do with modern sharks than what they were in the Carboniferous, but it just gives you an idea of those two basic grouping classifications. And so what are sharks? So sharks are fish, but fish are not sharks. There's some really distinct differences between sharks and fish, and the main thing to look for is normally the bilateral gill slits. So normally in sharks they have 5 to 7, like are shown here, and they also have different types of teeth. So they do serial tooth replacement, which is one of the reasons you find so many shark teeth in the fossil record, is because they're constantly replacing the teeth that they lose. So they can shed up to 3,000 to 6,000 in a lifetime, which is why they're so common. And they have slightly different things. So they don't have a swim bladder, which is quite a common thing in the bony fish. And they also have a slightly different, what you would call skin, and they have these types of scales, which I'll go into a little bit more detail after. But then there's the really, really obvious thing, is that they're composed of cartilage and not of bone. But you would think that might be a disadvantage, but it has been shown that cartilage can be just as dense and strong as bone. So having a bony skeleton isn't especially a sort of good trait. The fish took, it's just they went down a different path. And I mean, what's the difference between old and new sharks? This is quite a hard thing to look at, because when we do find shark teeth in the fossil records, you're actually looking a lot of the time at just isolated teeth, because the cartilage is not exactly going to preserve that well. There is some instances where we've got articulated shark material, which is great, and it's helped us try and like sort of recreate what they look like. But the big differences between modern sharks and the older sharks is that the brain cases in older sharks and ancient sharks were relatively small in comparison to their modern descendants. So you could look at that and think maybe with a smaller brain size, that might mean that their senses weren't as good overall, and it may have been a disadvantage. And the pectoral fins in ancient sharks tended to be really triangular and rigid, whereas in modern sharks they're quite curved, and it means that they're quite flexible. And again, that might have helped them maneuver a lot better than the ancient sharks did. And the ancient sharks had a backbone, but it was composed of multiple and relatively simple uncalcified vertebrae. But in contrast, modern sharks have quite complex structured vertebrae, and they are a lot harder as well. And in the jaws of early sharks, the upper jaws were fixed to the brain case at both the front and the back. But in modern sharks, the upper jaw is only fixed to the brain case at the back. And these are just different styles of sort of suspension, and it would have changed slightly how they ate. If you're more restricted with your jaw movements, they might not have been able to catch as much prey or as big a prey and things like that. But the photo that you can see on the right-hand side here is a reconstruction done for the Smithsonian Institution, and it shows you some of the sort of early sharks here, and you can see these really bizarre tooth forms that are going on, and they did just go a bit wild in the Carboniferous. And another thing that is different between sharks and fish is that they have these what are called a mineralized skeletal crust called tesserae, and on the right hand side here is a picture of some shark cartilage, and it's really hard to see in this photo because the rock is also so black. But when you move it in the light, the sort of structure of those tesserae actually reflect the light in different ways, and it's really, really beautiful. But unfortunately, we've not been able to find any that is in an articulated state. So the stuff we've got here is basically just a blob of cartilage, and there's no defining features of any of the sharks' morphology in there. But it's just really interesting to know that this stuff can be preserved, and that's, you know, quite a big block. So hopefully we will find some more of that. But the skeletal development in nearly all other vertebrate animals involves replacing unmineralized embryonic cartilage with a mineralized bony cartilage. That's you know, what happens for most vertebrate development. But because the skeletons of sharks don't mineralize, it's only stiffened by a thin outer layer of mineralized tissue, which is very, very thin. And that's what's broken up into these mosaic of minute tiles called tesserae. And they are really beautiful. There's a lot of work being done at these and looking to see how this extends across the different shark groups. But it's something we know from the fossil record as well. So there's quite a lot of evidence of that. But going into sharks, they've been around for a very long time, probably about 450 million years, possibly a bit longer. What I've got here is the geological time chart from the British Geological Survey. And over that 450 million years that sharks have been around, they've gone through some quite catastrophic events. So at the end of the Ordovician, there was a mass extinction event, which wiped out 85% of species on Earth. And then when we moved to the Devonian, at the end Devonian, about 80% of life was wiped out from the Earth. And then the Permian-Triassic extinction, you had about 95% of marine life wiped out and about 70% of terrestrial life wiped out. And between the Triassic and Jurassic, there's about 96% of life on Earth wiped out. And then the most recent mass extinction was the KPG, or Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, which wiped out the dinosaurs, where about 75% of life is wiped out. So there's these 5 major events that have happened over geological time, but we have evidence of sharks throughout all of that. So they've obviously been able to, for some reason, survive these catastrophic events where other animals and other lineages have gone extinct. So what is the earliest evidence of sharks that we have? Now, they are one of evolution's most enduring success stories, and the earliest sharks in the fossil record are basically defined by a handful of isolated scales. So not even teeth, but they are tooth-like structures, and we can be pretty confident that these did come from some type of shark. So this image on the right-hand side is some scanning electron images of these scales. You see they look a bit weird, but there is sort of microstructure in there. And but by looking at these and also looking at modern sharks, we can say with a pretty big degree of confidence that these did come from sharks. So we know then that's about 420 million years ago. And these come from the Silurian deposits in Siberia. And they're being assigned to a genus, which is Elasmobranchii, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but we don't actually have any clues to what the shark itself looked like. There is some earlier evidence of shark-like scales, which dates back to the Ordovician period, about 450 million years ago. But there is quite a lot of controversy and disagreement among paleontologists about the affinities of these. Although they appear to look quite like these scales, they do actually differ from those of modern sharks in some quite distinct ways. So that it would depend what paleontologist you were speaking to about when they're going to date the earliest evidence, but the consensus is about 420 million years ago from those Silurian deposits. And once you get to the Devonian period, the records become slightly more diverse and we have a bit more information. So the earliest fossil shark teeth from the Devonian are 400 million years old, but these teeth are only about 3 to 4 millimeters of length, and they exhibit 2 prongs and belong to an ancient shark known as Cladodus. And these are based on its multiple cusp teeth. The cusps are just these little bits that are coming off here. This is teeth from Cladodus, from the Devonian of Spain, and you can see they just have quite bizarre shapes, and these are really small, so only about 3 to 4 millimeters. And they resemble a type of shark known as the Euselchians, which are a freshwater shark, and they have these little teeth that almost look like rabbits because they have these 2 prongs coming off. So some people believe that they were related to those, but we're not quite sure. And again, it's because we only have the teeth and we have absolutely no articulated material to go along with that. But the oldest articulated material we have is from New South Wales in Australia. It's about 409 million years old, and this is a diagram on the right hand side. So normally when you're looking at a fossil, what you would do is you would have your image and then you try and pick out all the main morphological features and the things that you can use to then identify that animal. And this animal is known as Deleodus problematicus, and that is just because it is so complicated and it's very hard to actually try and work out what that animal looked like from this, but it is one of the oldest Chondrichthian brain cases that have been preserved, so it's a very significant discovery. And we can say at that point that, you know, we have those articulated shark remains and they are definitely from a shark. So there will be more ongoing research in this, and hopefully as more material is found, then that will update the consensus on what type of shark it was. And that's another thing that's quite important as well, is that the science is always changing, particularly with an animal like sharks. And because you find so many teeth in the fossil records, people have assigned those teeth to different species, but new evidence comes forward saying that they're actually the same species, but from a different bit of the mouth, which I'll go into a bit more detail later on. But we went from the Devonian, which was known as the age of fishes, to the Carboniferous, which is known as the golden age of sharks. And this gnarly dude on the right here, this is Dunkleosteus, belonging to the placoderms, and the placoderms just had these big bony plates, and they were like heavily head shielded fish, so you can see they were pretty gnarly. Now the only parts that really preserve that well are these sort of plates, so reconstructions are more based on just that part of the animal. We don't know fully what it would have looked like, but basically, when the Devonian extinction happened, the placoderms underwent a demise, and they disappeared from the records, and that basically gave the sharks an opportunity to start exploring all these new ecological niches and diversify, because the placoderm would have probably been one of the apex predators. So removing that from the ecosystem then gave the sharks a chance to start to evolve and employ all these sort of new feeding habits and things. So most Chondrichthyans, including holocephalians, evolving in the Carboniferous, possessed quite flat crushing dentitions. None of the sharks that lived in the Palaeozoic are around today, but modern sharks evolved from them, and many of the taxa were affected by later extinctions in the Permian, where about 96% of life was wiped out. But as we move into the Visean, which is the early Carboniferous, there's quite a lot of evidence from Scotland of some really, really cool sharks. This one is Cladodus, And this one is a medium-sized shark, and this is known from nodules from a place called Wardie. Now, Wardie Shore is a famous fossil site because you find lots of fossilized poo there, coprolites. But Stan Wood, most of our understanding of these types of fish and these fish assemblages came from Stan Wood and his collections and all the data that he sort of uncovered in his lifetime. And in the early 1970s, this is when we sort of get that more information about these sharks. But the type of environment of the oil shale groups is more of a brackish environment where you're getting changes in salinity. So it's not a marine environment, it's more of a freshwater where you're getting different fluxes and changes in salinity. But there was other species around at that time, and we have evidence of those, and it's quite cool because they're preserved within nodules. So it means that quite a lot of the shark material was three-dimensional, which means you can do things like CT scans, which you can see on the right-hand side here. The problem with that, though, is that you're never going to get completely exceptional preservation. The chances of that happening and the conditions being right are so low, which means that's why you need to try and find as many different examples so that you can put the big picture together. And essentially, with vertebrates, it's kind of like doing a big jigsaw puzzle, trying to piece all those bits together and work out how they all relate to each other. But these are some of the teeth which Stan Wood has found from these deposits, and you can see they have these distinct two prongs that I was talking about before, and they do look like rabbits, almost like the Donnie Darko rabbit. And they're very, very distinct. So normally when you see these, it's quite obvious what it is. But they are known from the skeletal remains preserved in these nodules. And as I say, it's, all that work that Stan Wood did and all the collections he did provided such an amazing understanding of this early Carboniferous fauna in Scotland. But there is a few different types of sharks that you do find there. But this is a reconstruction of one of these sharks that lived Wardie Shore when that was a lagoonal brackish environment. And it's always been kind of described as a problematic taxon because it has a very unusual morphology. So it's not actually that easy to place it in to the other groups of Paleozoic sharks. But we know that it was probably in habit of these fresh or brackish water lagoons and adapted to these varying degrees of salinity, which is very interesting because not all sharks would have possessed that ability. But that's something that it must have evolved due to the kind of place and the environments that it was living in. But you obviously can't mention Wardie without mentioning the awesome fossil jobby that you get there. So you can go to Wardie and you can just walk along the beach. Even at high tide, you'll still find some of these nodules. And you can split them open, like this one down here, to reveal the poo inside. And if you polish them, they polish really nicely. And you can actually see the spiral form of the coprolite there, which tells you a bit about the digestive system of the animal that did that. So it must have had some sort of coil in its digestive system. But you can see it quite nicely in this one here, the sort of concentric rings you get there. So you could polish that as well. And there's one here that it kind of weathered out on the nodule, and you can honestly pick those up like really regularly. It's a good fun thing to do. But moving on to more detail about shark tooth histology. Now, histology just means sort of the study of microstructure of tissues. So you kind of need to understand, because shark teeth are normally the only thing that we find, we need to have a really good understanding of how those are made and what they're composed of. Now, the bottom of the tooth is normally called the base, but it can sometimes be called the root. But it's not rooted into the skeleton like in a mammalian sense, so like we have our teeth rooted into our jaws. That's not how sharks lived with their teeth. But they consist of a dentine crown that's usually covered by a very hard substance. That is normally called enameloid as opposed to enamel, and that's to sort of avoid confusion between the form of dentine or enamel that we have in the sense of mammals. And this is just a really, really schematic diagram of the most basic morphology of a simple shark tooth. And you can see here, the crown is the top part. So that would have been the cutting edge or the slicing edge. But there's been a lot of sort of SEM analysis, which is scanning electron microscopy, looking at the detailed microstructure of these teeth, and it can really tell us quite a lot, because sometimes you're able to see the denticles and the bits where the nerves would have been passing nutrients to the teeth. It's really, really fascinating. But moving on to the different types of shark teeth in the Paleozoic. So now there's two major groups of teeth that can be distinguished, and these are known as the primitive type and Euselchian type. So I'm going to start with the primitive type and tell you a bit about those and what kind of animals, sharks, they would have been. So the primitive type, this tooth morphology, it used to be called Cladodont. However, it's now known that this type of tooth is represented in a much larger taxonomic groups, and that includes the xenocanthamorphs, which are those like two-pronged freshwater sharks that I was talking about before. Now, primitive teeth types are characterized by the tooth base being distinctly lingual. That means towards the tongue. And these teeth have foramina, which is where the nutrients and things pass to the teeth. But the crowns in this type are super, super diverse. But the overall morphology, we know that these sharks, particularly like here, the Cladodont tooth, what they would have been doing with these teeth is basically piercing their prey, allowed them to clutch them, and quite often they would just be swallowing those whole. But if you look on the sides of these teeth, you can see these other bits. These are known as the lateral cusps, and these little cusps may have been used as well to sort of help control that, and because they've got these striations on them, that would have also stopped the tooth from being ripped out as easily while they were biting prey. But they don't have any sort of morphology that gives us an indication that they would have used their teeth for crushing or grinding. So that means they probably would have been eating other fish or other sharks rather than eating marine animals like mollusks that have a hard shell. But they come in such a mad variety of shapes. And people are still discovering new teeth all the time, and every time we find new material, that obviously gives us more information about the sharks and, you know, the overall morphology of their dentition, because they wouldn't have just had one of these teeth, you know, they would have had a whole series of them. And this is a fossil from West Fife, where you can see some Saivodus teeth here. Now, this is absolutely amazing specimen, which belongs to Sam, and I'll always be incredibly jealous until I find a Saivodus multi-block. But this tooth is Saivodus striatus, and you can see that they have that big root there, that big base, and then they have that big long cusp there. And again, the cusp is full of striations, which help stop the tooth being ripped out by suction, a bit like ichthyosaurs have that on their teeth as well. And they have these quite flattened bases as well, which would have provided a bit of protection for the tooth, as you know, making it more anchored and secure within the mouth as well. And it's on a really, really beautiful bit of limestone as well. So this material, it looks a bit like a crinoidal limestone, but it's actually a big sort of clay nodule. And what was happening in the environment was this clay was just sort of rolling about and picking up all these little fossils that had disarticulated, including these Saivodus teeth. Now, Saivodus are one of the more rarer teeth to find. One reason for that is because they are quite delicate. They do have all these little cusps on the side, and then they're big long cusps, so they can get broken quite easily. And when you're looking for these types of teeth, when you're splitting rock to look for them, they don't necessarily like to split out very well, which is why you normally want to try and find them where they've been exposed naturally. And it just makes it a lot easier and avoids the tooth getting damaged. But unfortunately, that's not really how you find them most of the time. Sam does a lot of really good prep work on Saivodus. He's working on one just now, which when it broke, it completely just sort of shattered. But he's going to be putting that back together and prepping it. So that'll be a really cool one to see. But the more information we can get about these sharks, the better. We've not found any articulated material from Saivodus, unfortunately, but there is some work ongoing in Kentucky where they have actually found some articulated material in a cave there, which is really, really cool. And there's a chance that this material does exist in Scotland, but a problem is that the limestone that bears these teeth, that was actually used for industry and for burning for the lime industry. So it means that a lot of the material is no longer there, or it's not actually in situ, and it's really hard to sort of, you know, work out where stratigraphically this material was coming from.
Just before we move on, Katie, can you tell us the size of this block that we're looking at?
Oh yeah, sorry. So this altogether is about 30 centimeters tall. So the teeth, normally they are, you can get really tiny ones, which are like literally millimeters, but these ones are about sort of 2 centimeters, which are really cool. They're all, I think they're from the same individual, because it would be quite a coincidence for them to have come from different sharks and be sort of found so close together. But that's one of the things that we obviously really want to do, is try and find articulated material, or material where we can see you know, cartilage in association with the teeth, to try and build a better picture of what the dentition would have looked like. This is some other teeth here as well, which just show you different views of Saivodus. So when you're talking about the different views, it basically means either the position in the mouth that tooth would have come from, or what position you're looking at in the rock. So that would have depended on what side down the fossil was when it was preserved. But you can see the incredible detail in some of these teeth with all these little cusplets, and to find those intact and preserved, as I say, is quite a rare thing to see. That scale bar is 1 centimeter, so you can see that they're, you know, they're quite decent size, these ones. The one here, H, is showing you the back of the root basically, and that's the sort of flattened part of the root. Sometimes the cusps tended to sort of bend a little bit, and that was probably because of where it was in the mouth, obviously, to create the best sort of biting surface. If they were going to be piercing and swallowing prey whole, they'd probably want to be pretty effective at doing so. We don't know that much though about what Saivodus actually looked like, unfortunately, but it would have been pretty big, and it would have grown to about sort of 7 foot. And this is a reconstruction by John Paul Hodnett, who works in Kentucky, where I was saying they're finding a lot of really good articulated material at the moment. So what we'll be hoping to do is look at the diversity of sharks that they're finding in Kentucky and compare that with the Visean deposits we have here, and looking to see if we can piece together a bigger picture by sort of sharing that information and learning a bit more about how those animals would live together as well. But I really want to do like a really cool reconstruction, because I do think Saivodus probably was one of the most shark-looking sharks of the Carboniferous, because a lot of the sharks, as I say, because we don't actually have any articulated material, a lot of it is guesswork, and people are very reluctant to actually do a reconstruction when they don't actually have the information available. Obviously, we can look at modern sharks as an analogy for the ancient sharks, but there's still no way to know if things like the fin positioning and things would have been the same. And also with size as well, that's another thing that you can work out from tooth. Like the tooth size, what the body size would have been based on modern shark analogies. But again, that's something, there is a bit of a disagreement about that in the fossil record of sharks. The other type of primitive teeth you get, which are ones that we're finding in West Fife as well, are Cladodus. Now they look very, very similar to those Saivodus teeth, because they have that cusp in the center, but they don't have as many of these little latellar cusps, which are the ones at the side. And the top picture here is a view where you can see there's a brain case in there and the tooth that's associated with it. So they have a bit more information on Cladodus teeth, and this is just showing you sort of the different views. Now, when you find them, there's certain areas that they actually weather out really nicely out of the rock. So there's a couple of sites in Russia where they're actually finding these kind of teeth just popping out of the matrix, which is amazing. But as I say here, it's very, very rare. And we've actually only found one Cladodus tooth. And that tells us a bit as well about these sharks. Because they had quite big teeth, they would have been quite big predators, which means obviously there would have been less of those around in the ecosystem. But this is the Cladodus that were found in West Fife. And you can see here, it is a very, very distinct shark tooth shape. So this is the kind of one, if I'm doing outreach, it's always a good one to show kids, because they automatically relate that to like Megalodon and the great white with those pointy serrated teeth. Now, there would have been slight serrations on this, but as I say, the main purpose of these teeth was literally to pierce and grab, so that they could just swallow the prey. But again, it's on a really, really nice bit of limestone here, which is again a bit of a nodule. This tooth is only about 2 centimeters, but they're quite distinct, as I say, because you've got these triangular cusps here. But they're very, very beautiful teeth. But these are, this diagram here is the recent frilled shark. I'm not going to try and pronounce that, but this is an analogy for the primitive Palaeozoic teeth. So if you remember, I said that sharks do something which is serial replacement of their teeth. So they essentially have all these rows of teeth. And this is the sort of closest analogy we have to what these primitive teeth would have looked like within the animal's mouth in their dentition. So you can see that they all sort of have a slightly different angle so that they're all facing down. This one's quite a good image to see that, where you can see these cusps coming off. So they are pretty gnarly. You probably would not have wanted to be bitten by one of these dudes. Because as I say, the Saivodus could get, to about 7 foot. So the jaws would have been massive. But you can sort of see the layers of teeth in there. But what quite often happens in shark's teeth is the bases or the roots of these teeth usually overlap to some extent. This makes the tooth more stable, and it also means that the nutrition for the teeth can actually be provided by the same blood vessels, so it's a lot more efficient for the animal to do so. It uses less energy that way, and also because they overlapped, it made them more protected from being ripped out. But normally what would happen is once they lose a tooth, another one just essentially moves forward and takes the place of that. And it's a really effective system of tooth replacement. And again, why we find so many of these throughout the fossil records. But that's one of the things as well, is that, we can look at this and say that this is as close as we know to a dentition of these primitive teeth, but we'll never know for certain until we actually find that material articulated. So we're moving on to the next type of teeth, which is the Euselchian teeth. And these are a type of Paleozoic Chondrichtyan teeth, which are common in quite a few different groups. So they're common in the Hybodontiforms and also the Petalodontiforms, which I'll talk a bit more about, and the Holocephali. So if you remember, Holocephali branched off from the Elasmobranchii. So these teeth are, compared to your primitive teeth, are actually shorter, so they're a lot more stumpy. You can see in this image here. So these are examples of different base types of these teeth, and they're a lot longer and thinner than those primitive type teeth. But there's quite a few different examples of these these Euselchian teeth, which we'll look at. Let's see. So the Petalodonts, now I've talked about these before in my last talk, so it's necessary to give Petalodonts a special mention. Although they fall into that second category of teeth, many of them are incredibly specialized, and it means they had some quite bizarre forms. This guy here is called Petalodus acuminatus, and it's because it's acuminate. You can see that point at the top there. This is just a drawing showing you the overall morphology of those teeth, and that's the root there. You can see it was quite a big flat base, that root there, so it would have provided quite a good support for the tooth. But it's thought that this sort of evolution of the Petalodont teeth was because it might have been an evolution because of what they were eating, because they weren't really living on, like, they wouldn't have been able to crush mollusks and things with these teeth. So their name, Petalodont, petal meaning like, thin petal from a flower, that's where they get their name from, but they do have very, very sharp serrations on the top of the tooth. So they would have been really effective slicing teeth. But there's no evidence of separate cusps in those. So you remember those other teeth that we looked at, they have those little branching cusps at each side. Petalodonts just seem to have this big one cutting surface. An interesting thing that you do sometimes find is that the cutting edge is actually crenulated, which means that it's kind of wavy. Some examples of that might be a pathology. So that might be something that it's been wrong with the shark. Maybe it's had some sort of disease that's affected its tooth growth in its life, but also it would create a bigger surface area and make it more effective at actually ripping stuff. So that would be another reason for that kind of evolution. But petalodonts are the most common type of shark that we find in the West Fife deposits. And that would just be to do with where they were in the ecosystem. So you probably would find that your Saivodus and Cladodus would have been feeding on the petalodonts. You can get some really, really big petalodont teeth, but we've also found some really small ones. So this one's about 3 centimeters altogether, but we've found ones that are, within millimeters. And they do have a wide variety of shapes. Some more here. So this is another petalodont tooth, Petalodus acuminatus again. I absolutely love these ones and the way that they're preserved with this really black colour. Now this is in limestone, and Sam's prepared this by using a mixture of acid, which dissolves away the calcium carbonate of the limestone, and then you can remove some of the excess rock from around the surface. So here we have the base or the root, and then these little lines here are the bottom of the crown, and then your top is your cutting surface. And again, I'm not sure how well you can see, but there are some really, really nice little striations here. And sometimes when you find these and they're falling out of the matrix, they are incredibly sharp. They still do have that really sort of sharp surface. So definitely would have been very good cutting teeth. But now I'm going to move on from the petalodonts to the holocephali. So they're the ones that I discussed earlier, which are your chimaeras. So that's like your ghost sharks and things. Now, holocephali are quite bizarre, and they're a bit different when we think of sharks. Because I said sharks replaced their teeth serially, we don't actually think holocephali or chimaeras did that, and they probably would have grown their teeth very, very slowly. And what they actually had, rather than teeth in what we think of teeth, they had these things called plates. So here are some examples of Cladodus plates, and this here is a reconstruction of what the dentition would have looked like. Now this is all sort of based on looking at modern chimera and trying to work out how they feed and what sort of animals that they're actually trying to eat. But they're anchored, the teeth are anchored by fibers to the jaw, and the tooth plates are so heavily mineralized. And what we think happened is that when the animal died, these would have just been scattered around the place. So quite often they are the only part of the animal that you find preserved, and some of them just look really, really bizarre. And that's the other issue, is how did these plates fit together? So Cladodus is one of the holocephalans which has been reconstructed in a few different forms. So basically when other people find new teeth, and I said they were assigned to a new species, they've then discovered that actually some of these teeth are from the same shark and just from a different position. So if you look at this photo, you can see the shark teeth here look like they've got that kind of separation on them, and as you get up here, they're more fused together. And that could be an evolutionary thing, because if your teeth are fused together, they're probably more effective, and you'll be able to get nutrients and things traveling through that a lot easier. But one of those things is that the teeth, depends on how you find it in the rock, can look very, very different. So we'll look at some of the holocephali that were found in Fife. So here's some Cladodus teeth. Now this one's about 2 centimeters, and you can see there's like a few of them scattered together. Now this is very, very rare to find more than one in the same bit of rock. But the dentitions of these holocephalans would have consisted of 2 to 3 pairs of upper tooth plates, and then 1 or 2 on the bottom, and these tooth plates would have been used to grind together. And that would crush things like your mollusks and gastropods and things. And because they could eat these specialised hard-shelled prey, that's why they had such robust teeth. But the anterior tooth plates, or anterior to the tooth plates, Halodus actually had some separate teeth as well, which were single cusped. You can almost see the cusp in there. And these are discrete teeth that wouldn't have actually been joined onto their tooth plate. And these teeth would have been shed in life and usually would have been separated from the tooth plate when you find it. So you don't normally find them in the vicinity of each other, unfortunately. But this is one of the only examples we've found where we've got more than one tooth in the block. So it's a really, really cool sample. But the next one, which is Psammodus, I think is one of the most awesome fossils, but it's probably one of the most underwhelming fossils. So this here on the right-hand side is part of a Psammodus tooth plate. Now this is huge, that's my hand underneath it there. So you know, you're looking at a big, big plate. Now we think that these tooth plates fitted together a bit like a pavement in design, like you can see on the right hand side here, and it would have created these big grinding surfaces. So again, super good for eating like your hard shelled mollusks and everything. But you can see the detail on this tooth here, and this sort of enameloid that's preserved, and all these little dentine tubercles and things, which is where the nutrients and stuff would have been flowing. And these were such cool sharks. But as I say, this one, when Sam found it, he entered a competition on a fossil forum, and it won the most underwhelming fossil of the month. And it's just because it looks just like a big lump of rock or something. So you kind of need to know what you're looking for when you're looking for shark teeth. But once you get your eye in, you start to see how different they look from the surrounding rock, and you pick up on all those really detailed bits of the structure there. But another one that's quite a cool weird crusher is Copodus. Now, what we're looking at here is the lower and the upper dentition of a Copodus tooth here. Now this one was found a couple of years ago by Sam, and the one on the right hand side I found quite recently. And they're both from Fife, and these two would have fitted together. Now this one's not been fully prepared yet, but once it's done we're going to sort of see if we can fit them together. But from looking at them, you can see how this is concave and this is slightly convex. They would have sat on top of each other, which is really, really cool. But these are the only two sort of examples that we have that are complete. Quite often when you find them, they are just fragments or little bits of them, so unfortunately it's quite hard to see. But these are really, really cool teeth as well. But moving on to Cladodus, now this kind of just looks like a little slug or something. When you see these in a rock, it's quite hard to sort of work out what you're looking at. You can see the kind of patchy coloration on this one. Now this is quite interesting because a couple of people think that this might actually be the original colorations of the teeth. Based at looking at modern chimera teeth and things, that maybe is the original pattern you're seeing, which is really, really cool. But the surface of them are just full of these tiny, tiny little holes, which are all the dentine tubercles. And on the right hand side here is a reconstruction of what the jaw would have looked like. So the top one here is the top jaw, and the bottom, that's your lower jaw. Now they would have just sat on top of each other, and again you would have get that grinding motion. It would just been able to crush loads of hard things and shells. But as I say, these are quite rare in the deposits that we look at. So we know that the Holocephali, that they were very varied and diverse in the Carboniferous, but we just don't know exactly how they were living with the other sharks, just because we've not got enough information yet. And the other thing as well is because they're not replacing their teeth regularly, there's a lot less in the fossil record as well. So you've got that you're much less likely to find a crusher tooth there, or a plate dentition. But it's something that we are looking for in particular at the moment, because we really do want to try and understand the full sort of ecology of what was going on in the early Carboniferous of Scotland. But just to sort of summarise that, there's a very common misconception that sharks are creatures that have somehow managed to avoid evolution and they're survived to modern day virtually unchanged, but that is a load of nonsense. As I said, undergone 2 major radiations and several smaller ones, the most recent being the one that eventually resulted in humans and mammals, but they've also undergone all these extinction events and managed to survive. So even the early Carboniferous, when we saw like a totally wide variety of sharks in different forms and lifestyles, not all of these were actually successful because we still don't see them around today. But the sharks that did survive basically took all of those good traits from their ancestors, and the modern sharks we see today are the result of hundreds of millions of years of perfecting that evolution. So while they are ancient, there's nothing really primitive about the modern descendants. They're kind of working on a model that worked really well and just taking all the good bits from that to sort of, you know, go forwards. So the further research that we want to do when looking at these Carboniferous deposits in Fife is to try and understand fully the species distribution and the relative amounts of each species, so that we can work out a bit more about the trophic levels, and that's just to do with the sort of food chain and what was going on. And we find most of our shark teeth in association with other invertebrate fossils, so like your crinoids and brachiopods and other animals that were really common in these shallow seas of the Carboniferous. And quite a few people ask if there is any sort of modern systems that are similar to these Carboniferous ones, and in terms of the fauna and the types of animals and sharks you find, there's not, but you do get modern carbonate environments. So there is systems where you know, coral reef systems and things where there's carbonate production. But in terms of the actual fauna, the Paleozoic, the early Carboniferous was very, very distinct. So hopefully by finding more information out about these early sharks, we can then piece together exactly how those animals were living, but also what made them be able to diversify, because conservation paleontology is a really, really important thing. And that's when you look at past events, so past events like mass extinctions, and try and work out how these animals responded to these events. And that can help tell us a lot about how we can sort of tackle future changes in climate, which is something obviously is very important at the moment. So we're hoping that by looking at these early Carboniferous deposits, they'll help us understand more about the mass extinction in Devonian and how we can sort of understand how animals will react to these changes that are going to happen globally. But yeah, that's pretty much me for that talk. There's so many more shark teeth that I could show, but there's just far too many of them. But I hope that was like a good enough introduction for everyone and that everybody thinks sharks are really cool. But does anybody have any questions?